The Haunted Asylum: A Journey into Madness. Urban exploration can take you to some of the most mysterious and eerie places on Earth. This story follows three friends who ventured into an abandoned asylum, seeking the thrill of the unknown. What they encountered inside those crumbling walls was far beyond anything they could have imagined. The lure of the asylum. It was an old building, long forgotten by the world, and left to decay on the outskirts of a small town. The asylum had been shut down in the late 1960s after a series of gruesome incidents that left a dark stain on its history. The townspeople whispered about the place, saying it was haunted, cursed, and filled with the restless spirits of those who had suffered within its walls. But for Mark, Jess, and Dylan, the asylum was the perfect spot for an urban exploration adventure. They were thrill seekers, always on the lookout for new and exciting places to explore. They had heard the rumors, but they didn't believe in ghosts. To them, the asylum was just another forgotten building, waiting to be rediscovered. One autumn afternoon, they decided to make their move. Armed with flashlights, cameras, and a map of the old asylum grounds they found online, they set off just as the sun began to dip behind the trees. The approach to the asylum. The asylum was tucked away in a dense forest, its presence hidden from the road by towering trees and thick underbrush. The path leading to it was overgrown, barely visible beneath the tangle of weeds and roots. As they walked, the trees seemed to close in around them, their branches twisting into unnatural shapes. When they finally reached the asylum, they were struck by its sheer size. The building was massive, a crumbling monolith of red brick and iron, with windows shattered and walls covered in graffiti. Ivy crawled up its sides, giving it an appearance of something alive, something waiting. "This place is insane," Dylan said, his voice tinged with excitement. "I can't believe it's still standing," Mark grinned, pulling out his camera. "Let's see what we can find inside." Entering the asylum. The entrance to the asylum was a set of large wooden doors, once grand, but now rotting and hanging off their hinges. Mark gave the door a push, and it swung open with a loud creak, revealing the dark interior. The smell hit them first, a mix of damp, mold, and something else. Something that smelled like decay. Jess wrinkled her nose. "Gross. This place smells like death." They stepped inside, the light from their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The lobby was enormous, with a high ceiling and a grand staircase that led to the upper floors. The walls were peeling, and the floor was littered with debris, broken glass, old furniture, and papers scattered as if the building had been abandoned in a hurry. "Let's stick together," Mark suggested, though he couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The asylum seemed to hum with an unseen presence, as if the walls themselves were watching them. The first discovery. They began to explore, moving cautiously through the building's many rooms and hallways. The asylum was a maze of corridors, each one leading to more doors, more rooms, each more decayed than the last. The atmosphere grew heavier as they ventured deeper into the building, the silence pressing in on them. In one of the rooms, they found a set of old patient files, stacked neatly on a desk covered in dust. Jess picked up one of the files and opened it, revealing yellowed pages filled with typewritten notes. "Check this out," she said, holding up the file. "These are patient records. Some of these go back to the 1940s. Mark took the file from her and read a few lines. The notes described a patient who had been committed for severe psychosis, his condition deteriorating rapidly after being admitted. The final entry simply read, "Patient unresponsive. Transferred to the lower levels." "What do you think happened to him?" Dylan asked, his voice hushed. "I don't know," Mark replied, flipping through the pages. "But it looks like he wasn't the only one. There are dozens of files here, all with similar notes. The lower levels." The mention of the lower levels piqued their curiosity. According to the map they found online, the asylum had a basement that housed the most dangerous and disturbed patients. It was said that the basement was where the worst of the experiments were conducted, where patients were subjected to inhumane treatments in the name of science. "Let's go check it out," Dylan suggested, already moving toward the staircase that led to the basement. Jess hesitated. "Are you sure that's a good idea? The lower levels are probably in the worst shape, but the allure of discovering something truly eerie was too strong," and they all agreed to go. The staircase to the basement was narrow and steep, the walls closing in around them as they descended. The air grew colder, and the smell of decay became almost unbearable. When they reached the bottom, they found themselves in a long, dark corridor. The walls were damp, the floor slick with moisture. Their flashlights revealed doors on either side, each one marked with a small metal plaque, the names of patients barely legible beneath the rust. "This place is seriously creepy," Dylan muttered, his voice echoing off the walls. They opened one of the doors, revealing a small, windowless room. Inside was a single metal bed, its mattress torn and stained. Chains were bolted to the walls, and the floor was covered in deep scratches, as if someone had tried desperately to escape. "God, what happened here?" Jess whispered, her voice shaking. The unexplained sounds. As they continued to explore the basement, they began to hear strange sounds, soft whispers, distant footsteps, the faint clinking of chains. Every time they stopped to listen, the sounds would cease, only to start again as soon as they moved. "I think we should go back upstairs," Mark said finally, his nerves getting the better of him. "This place is giving me the creeps." But just as they turned to leave, they heard a loud crash from further down the corridor, as if something heavy had been thrown against the wall. They froze, their hearts pounding, and then the lights in the corridor flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. Mark, Jess called out, panic rising in her voice. "I'm here," Mark replied, his flashlight flickering back on. "Dylan, where are you?" There was no answer. Mark and Jess frantically searched the corridor, their flashlights darting back and forth, but Dylan was gone. The search for Dylan. Panic set in as they searched the basement for their friend. They called his name, their voices echoing off the walls, but there was no response. The basement seemed to stretch on forever, the corridors twisting and turning, leading them deeper into the labyrinth. As they moved through the darkness, they began to see things, shadows moving at the edge of their vision, shapes that seemed to flit in and out of existence. The air grew colder, and the whispers returned, louder this time, as if they were coming from just behind them. "Dylan," Mark shouted, his voice hoarse. "Where are you?" Finally, they found a door at the end of the corridor, slightly ajar. Mark pushed it open, revealing a large room filled with old medical equipment, rusted gurneys, broken cabinets, and jars filled with unidentifiable substances. And in the center of the room, lying on the floor, was Dylan, the figure in the dark. They rushed to Dylan's side, but he was unconscious, his face pale and clammy. Mark shook him, trying to wake him, but Dylan remained unresponsive. "What happened to him?" Jess asked, her voice trembling with fear. "I don't know," Mark replied, his heart racing. "We need to get him out of here." But as they lifted Dylan, the door behind them slammed shut with a deafening bang, and the lights flickered again. When the light returned, they saw a figure standing in the corner of the room, shrouded in darkness. Its face was hidden, but they could feel its eyes on them, watching, waiting. Mark and Jess froze, fear paralyzing them. The figure took a step forward, and the air grew colder, the whispers growing louder, filling their minds with a cacophony of voices. "Get out," the voices hissed, echoing in the room. "Get out before it's too late." The escape. With a surge of adrenaline, Mark and Jess dragged Dylan to his feet, pulling him toward the door. The figure in the corner remained motionless, but the sense of danger was palpable. They reached the door and yanked it open, fleeing into the corridor with Dylan between them. The basement seemed to come alive as they ran, the walls closing in, the floor buckling beneath their feet. The whispers followed them, growing louder, more frantic, as if the very building was trying to keep them trapped. Finally, they reached the staircase and began to climb, the heavy air making it feel as if they were moving through water. Behind them, the sounds of footsteps echoed, growing closer with each step, but they didn't look back. They couldn't. Something told them that if they did, they would never make it out. The return to the surface. They burst through the door at the top of the stairs, back into the asylum's main lobby. The building seemed different now, darker, more menacing, as if it had been waiting for them all along. They didn't stop running until they were outside, the cold night air hitting them like a wave. They collapsed on the ground, gasping for breath, their hearts racing. Dylan began to stir, groaning as he slowly regained consciousness. What happened?" he mumbled, his voice weak. "We're safe," Jess said, her voice shaking. "We're out." But as they looked back at the asylum, its dark silhouette against the night sky, they couldn't shake the feeling that they had barely escaped with their lives. The building stood silent and still, but they knew that something had followed them out, something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The aftermath. They never spoke of what happened in the asylum, but the experience left a lasting mark on them. Dylan suffered from nightmares for weeks afterward, his sleep filled with visions of the dark figure and the endless corridors. Jess couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, even in the safety of her own home. And Mark, though he tried to forget, found himself drawn back to the asylum in his dreams, the whispers calling him back to the darkness. The townspeople continued to avoid the asylum, their whispers growing more insistent, more fearful. And though the building still stood, forgotten and decaying, it was no longer just an abandoned place. It was a prison, a trap, a gateway to something far more terrifying than they could have ever imagined.